So I'll start with just a quote by Dogen, a wise soul from many, many years ago. I think 12th century, maybe 8th century, I believe Dogen. Anyway, he's very old, sage, and a Buddhist, a monk. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by all things. And I think I'll share another one. This is also a Chinese, this is an 8th century Chinese sage. Nature may be compared to a vast ocean. Thousands and millions of changes are taking place in it. Crocodiles and fish are essentially of the same substance as the water in which they live. People are crowded together with the myriad other things in the great changingness, and their nature is one with that of all other natural things. Knowing that I am of the same nature as all other natural things, I know that there is really no separate self, no separate personality, no absolute death, and no absolute life. So tonight, I'd like to share with you a teaching that is considered really to be one of the most essential teachings of the Buddha, and one that's really at the heart of his realization, his awakening. And it's the teaching of Anatta, or no self, non-self. For most of us, this isn't necessarily an easy teaching to grasp, as it's not so obvious or intuitive, and it runs really kind of counter to our common sense views of our lives and our experience. Because, it seems so obvious, here I am, I'm the self, there's a self. But this very teaching on non-self has been what's really led countless of beings over the years into full liberation. So Russell told me tonight I should tell a joke, so I have a joke. There was a monk this is an old one, you might have heard this, it's a little corny, but a monk went into the bank to cash a check. And the teller said, I'll need some form of identification, sir. So the monk looked at him a little puzzled, but he reached into his robe and he pulled out a mirror and he looked in the mirror and said, "It's me, okay?" Our grasping and identification with a sense of self is very, very strong. So what are the insights necessary to cut through these very deeply and habituated patterns of attachment and identification? As we practice meditation, it really is a practice of seeing our experience more directly. That's what we're doing. And as we deepen our practice, Impermanence. As we deepen our practice, the more intimate we become with our experience. We really become, just very intimate with the breath and our body sensations and the thoughts, to actually sense the thoughts as they come and go, to really be with this direct pulsing and kind of pooling of what goes on in our beings. I mean, this is a pretty intimate experience that we have when we sit down with ourselves to sit and just observe what is the nature, the true nature of our experience. We note what is arising in the body moment to moment, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant or neutral sensations. And the guidance invites us to meet emotions, thoughts as they arise without really getting caught up in the content of these experiences. And our meditation guidance encourages us to drop down below into the realm that's really below concepts so that we can really meet our experience, this alive experience, more directly. And as we start to observe in this way, we notice that all of our experience is in constant change. Constantly. Everything is moving, changing. This is impermanence, or Anicca, the characteristic of Anicca. And Holly gave a beautiful talk a few weeks ago about impermanence, about this characteristic. And not only is our experience impermanent, but we also discover that life experience is ultimately unsatisfactory. And this doesn't mean that, we don't have happy times and that there's beauty and love and joy and laughter in our lives. But we eventually discover our experience is unreliable as a place for lasting happiness or contentment. And this is dukkha. So this is the second characteristic. So you might recognize these, one of the really important teachings of the Buddha are the three characteristics of existence. So this impermanence, the impermanent nature of the way things are constantly changing. And then the fact that there is no lasting happiness, that suffering is another interpretation of dukkha, that eventually, we die, the body's age, everything is changing, everything that we have is at some point lost. And that's the way it is. That's the nature of existence, of experience. So this third characteristic is anatta, and this is the non-self. And I was thinking this afternoon, this is a teaching that ever since I started meditating many years ago has always eluded me, and I've always had a problem kind of wrapping my head around trying to understand this non-self. It's like it just didn't make sense. But I'm finding with more practice and going deeper in the understandings of what the Buddha is really teaching us, and this is a very amazing teaching, that we can really go in and see that there is no permanent fixed sense of a self here. It just isn't. You don't have to take my word for it, but the Buddha is inviting us to practice that and see for ourselves, to really take up the investigation that we can do that. So I'd like to talk mostly about this third characteristic and a bit about how we might begin exploring this directly in our practice and experience. So, because of impermanence, we see a causal factor of the unreliability, the disappointment, the suffering that is caused by everything and it coming to an end. And that's related to that impermanence and dissatisfaction are much easier to identify in our practice because we're observing the ever-present change around us with this constant kind of flow and flux. The third characteristic, the non-self aspect of our nature, is really insubstantial. It's a transient flux of experience. That's how it's described. We live in a mind constructing a sense of self and world all the time. But when we really closely investigate that, we find that there is nothing solid, there's nothing permanent, and there's nothing lasting. So cultivating awareness of these three characteristics, seeing these particular qualities and aspects of our experience, is insight. And this is what gives insight meditation its name, seeing clearly into these three characteristics of our experience. The insight of anicca, or impermanence, allows the mind to go deeply and understand that things are impermanent, and gradually the mind stops clinging. When the mind knows deeply dukkha, or how unreliable, knows the suffering nature of our experience, the mind knows that clinging will lead to more suffering, and it gradually stops. That hadn't been my experience, but it slows down some, but it hasn't stopped. But when the mind deeply recognizes that there isn't anyone here to have to defend or protect, the characteristic of anatta, non-self, then there is no need for any reactivity. After the Buddha's enlightenment, his second discourse, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the discourse on the characteristics of non-self. And it gives us the instruction in this characteristic of non-self. He tells us how to look, how to investigate, and how to understand this experience. So, one of the ways he does this is to point to the aspect of control. When we consider or relate to what we think of as a self, there's often an aspect of having some kind of control around it. Like who chooses or who decides. That's often a place that we might feel a sense of self. This someone here who's choosing, or someone here that's deciding, or someone seems to have some kind of control over this being. And what is this self? I mean, what is this someone? So the Buddha begins the discourse with speaking to that. And he does this exploration through the framework of the Five Aggregates. And this is another really important teaching that, with all of the Buddha's teachings, I focus on one and then it really ties in and interrelates with another. And we find with time, as we learn more and more about these different teachings and practices, how they make this beautiful mosaic of understanding, and it goes deeper with more nuances of meaning. And this is one of those frameworks, the Five Aggregates, that time and time again we come back to see how important this teaching is. And as we look through this framework, and this shows some of I think the Buddha's really, it was brilliant that he found out that there's no experience that lies out of this framework of the Five Aggregates. And the Five Aggregates being form and feeling and perception and volitional or mental formations and consciousness. So these are the pointers of having our direct experience. And I'll hopefully bring this to a level that is a little bit more understandable instead of this language. So the Five Aggregates also are called the five heaps of things, and sometimes referred to as the heaps of stuff. So it's kind of the stuff of our existence, of what we're made out of. Again, this form and feeling. This is who we are: form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. Now, I'm just really kind of skidding the surface here. But I think that this is an important conversation for us to have and keep deepening, because it's such an important teaching to really begin to understand this important characteristic as a part of our existence, of our nature, of our experience. So the Buddha uses this framework as a way to kind of deconstruct the idea of a self. And he says, and this is from the teachings, form is not self. And if you think, form here is anything that's like the physical elements, and if you think of it in terms of our body as form, we are form. We fit into that category. Form is not self. For if form were self, this form would not lead to affliction. And it would be possible to determine of form. Let my form be thus. Let my form not be thus. And because form is not self, form leads to affliction. And it is not possible to determine a form. Let my form be thus. Let my form not be thus. So when we experience the body as form, he's saying the body is not self, because we can't say to our bodies, like, don't age, don't get sick, don't get the flu. We really don't have control over these bodies. So how can we say these bodies are a self? They run on their own conditions and causes and the changing flux of nature and the laws of nature and how it works. And it's not a self. So we can't say that the body is a self. So, okay, so maybe if the body's not a self, then there's got to be something that explains or, that gets closer to, what is this that I'm calling myself? And, here I am. So he says, feeling is not self, perception is not self, volitional formations are not self, consciousness is non-self. For if consciousness was self, the consciousness would not lead to affliction, and it would be possible to determine consciousness. Let my consciousness be thus. Let my consciousness not be thus. But because consciousness is non-self, consciousness leads to affliction, and it is not possible to determine consciousness. Let my consciousness be thus. Let my consciousness not be thus. So how many of us would, if we could, say, let my consciousness be calm, peaceful, easy? We can't do that. There's nothing that we're in connection with that controls our consciousness. So the Buddha points to this as undermining this belief that we have around this aspect of control being who I am, that we're not in control of this process, this moving flux that we're living. And he goes on to talk about the other two characteristics. Everything in our experience is impermanent. Form is impermanent. Feelings are impermanent. Perceptions are impermanent. Volitional formations are impermanent. Consciousness is impermanent. So in this part of the sutta, the Buddha is really encouraging us to look at what we call self and to explore, does it really make sense? Does what we call self, because there is something that we call self, but whatever this is, does it really stand up to this investigation that he's offering us through working with the five aggregates? So the sutta, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, points us in the direction, I think, of the way that shows us how to really begin this process of just investigating, to be curious about what this is about the self, because this is one of the biggest causes of suffering that we have when we become really identified with this sense of who I am, and we get all caught up in and an I and me and mine, and we lose the sense of the bigger nature and who we truly are. So our views are so strong that we are a self, and it's so reinforced, and it just seems so obvious that we do. So some of the views that we have about this self is that there's a sense of continuity or some kind of a history. So, that I'm this self because, I was born, I had this family, I can, remember all of this life that I've had. So there's got to be somebody here doing that. There's also the sense of just a feeling or a knowing that there's a sense of self. And sometimes we feel like that's enough of a confirmation. Or maybe there's a self that remembers things, so there must be a self that remembers. Or it might be the one who seems to be in control, the one who decides, the one who chooses. It might be the one who feels or knows or experiences. Actually, there's a lot of evidence out there about non-self, but it's like we're conveniently ignore all the evidence. To the contrary, we tend to delude ourselves by seeing things through a certain lens, and that's what we see. And then what we see confirms their beliefs, and so it goes. The Buddha directs us to look at our experience of a solid self and investigate it. Whether view, feelings, sense of solid body, whatever it is, however we sense self, it can be a really rich and juicy place to start to investigate in our practice. And he asks us, does what we see or what we experience as a sense of self, does it really hold up when we start to investigate? Buddha said, consciousness is not self. If consciousness is self, let it be thus. So maybe a concrete example of this, when we sit down to meditate and we put attention on our breath, or if your attention is on the flow of changing experience, whatever your focus is, and you notice that the mind starts wandering. So who did that wandering? If you did the wandering, were you the one who decided to stay put? And even more mind-blowing, that in that spaced out place of the mind doing its thing, suddenly mindfulness reappears. Who did that? Causes and conditions came together for mindfulness to reappear. Just simple as that. There's no one there doing this. At some point, what we perceive as a self starts to fall apart, and a constructed self shows itself out of all the old patterns and conditioning of many, many years, decades, eons of time, all the things that have happened, causes and conditions coming together. We can, like, all of a sudden, or I notice this for myself, sometimes just all of a sudden there'll be this sadness that comes up, and it's a sense that I'm a sad person at that moment, or anger will just come out of nowhere, and it's like, where did that come from? There's not this sense that there's anything to grab on here. This is happening. It's happening all the time in this flux of change. And it's not a solid sense of self. So sometimes analogies can be helpful, pain is a good one. Like when we're sitting and we are noticing a pain in the body, a knee, leg pain, or some pain. It's so easy to see that it's a thing, that this pain is something. But when we start to investigate it, as we do a lot when we're sitting and body stuff comes up, we really start to see how it breaks up. It's just this whole myriad of feelings, of sensations. It can be sharpness, it can be dull, it can feel big, it can, this throbbing sensation. But there's no sense of solidity there. So we can kind of think of that as a kind of an entree as you think about the self. I mean, there's no really solid sense of self that's here that we can really hold on to. There's another one that's analogy of the river. So, what is a river? I mean, can you kind of get that? I mean, we can give it a name, but is that the river? Or water? Is that the river? We could take a bucket full of water out. Is that the river? Could be a stream bed that is changing. Is that the river? I mean, what is a river? And also the analogy of a rainbow. What is a rainbow? Is that a thing or something? It takes a certain kind of conditions to come together for there to be this manifestation or for a rainbow to appear. There needs to be moisture in the air, there needs to be sunlight or light, and there needs to be a receiver, someone that perceives. And all of these have to come together in a particular time and space and location for all of that to come together for there to be a rainbow. But what is a rainbow? So there's one other sutta that I'd like to introduce as a way that, again, is kind of a pointer toward this teaching of no self. And this is Bahaya Sutta. And I don't have time to go into the story. This has become one of my favorite suttas. Bahaya is an interesting person that comes to the Buddha for the teachings, and he's traveled a long distance. So what happens with the Buddha and then what happens after the teachings is pretty interesting. But I want to kind of just give you the heart of it, because he asked the Buddha for the teachings in brief. And the Buddha responded, "You should train yourself thus. In the seen is only the seen. In the heard is only the heard. In the sensed is only the sensed. In the cognized is only the cognized. This is how you should train yourself." So this is the training then, and it's the training for us now. And this is what we do, the simplicity of meeting our experience just as it is. So we meet our experience just below this level of concept, so that the seen is only the seen, the heard only the heard, the sensed only the sensed, the cognized only the cognized. And then the Buddha goes on to state what the results of this practice are. When for you in the seen is only the seen, and the heard is only the heard, and the sensed is only the sensed, the cognized is only the cognized, then, Bahaya, there is no you in terms of that. When there is no you in terms of that, then there is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor yonder, nor in between the two. This, just this, is the end of suffering. The Buddha points to this as a result of practice, and this is an important insight that can come with practice. We don't have to believe it, even. All we really need to do is just come back to the simplicity of experience. In the seen is only the seen, in the heard only the heard, and underneath the level of the concept, the cognized is only the cognized. As we sit, we can recognize a concept is just another construction of the mind rather than believing that it's really a thing. So we don't even need to believe this teaching, and we don't even have to think about it. So you can just really let this whole talk go out of your minds and just come back to the simplicity of meeting your experience moment to moment. Because really, this is the practice. The simplicity of meeting experience just like it is. This is the intimacy with our life. Trust in that. The insights really come from that. Let me just sit with a moment. This is not an easy thing to grasp, and you can tell I'm new at making my way into this, but I really have, a lot of, really energy and passion for these teachings that really are such promise that really can free us and free our minds and hearts. We really can be liberated to freedom. So I wish that for all beings. Let's sit for a moment. May all beings everywhere be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Thank you for your kind attention.